August 19, 1991. Moscow wakes to find tanks rolling through its streets. The Soviet Union's president has vanished. 8 men have seized control of the world's largest country, commanding the most powerful military force on Earth. They call themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency. In Russian, the GKChP. Within 72 hours, their coup would collapse. But in those 3 days, the fate of nuclear weapons, 15 republics, and nearly 300 million people hung in the balance. This is the story of the last gasp of Soviet power, a desperate gamble by true believers who couldn't accept that their world was ending. This is lost history. This is the GKChP. To understand the coup, we need to rewind 6 years. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party. He inherited an empire that was rotting from within, an economy strangled by central planning, a military bleeding out in Afghanistan, and a population that had stopped believing the lies. Gorbachev's answer was glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. He wanted to save socialism by reforming it. Instead, he unleashed forces he couldn't control. By 1991, the Soviet Union was coming apart. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were demanding independence. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Eastern European communist governments had toppled like dominoes. Inside Russia itself, Boris Yeltsin, Gorbachev's rival, had been elected president of the Russian Republic, creating a competing power center. The hardliners watched in horror. These were men who had spent their lives serving the Soviet system. KGB officers, military commanders, Communist Party officials. To them, Gorbachev wasn't saving socialism. He was destroying everything they'd built. In the summer of 1991, Gorbachev was preparing to sign a new Union treaty. This agreement would have given the republics massive autonomy, essentially transforming the Soviet Union from a centralized empire into a loose confederation. For the hardliners, this was the final straw. They decided to act. The plotters called themselves the GKChP, the State Committee on the State of Emergency. 8 men, each commanding a pillar of Soviet power. Gennady Yanayev, the vice president, a weak man, an alcoholic, chosen by Gorbachev precisely because he seemed harmless. The conspirators needed him because, constitutionally, only the vice president could assume presidential powers. Valentin Pavlov, the prime minister, an economist who blamed Gorbachev's reforms for the USSR's economic collapse. Boris Pugo, Minister of Internal Affairs, commanding the National Police Force, a true believer in Soviet power. Dmitry Yazov, Minister of Defense, a World War II veteran, the man who controlled the Soviet military. Vladimir Kryuchkov, head of the KGB, the spy chief, perhaps the most dangerous man in the conspiracy, commanding the vast apparatus of the secret police. Oleg Baklanov, Deputy Defense Council Chairman, overseeing the military-industrial complex. Vasily Starodubtsev and Alexander Tizyakov, representing agriculture and industry, giving the coup a veneer of civilian support. These men controlled the guns, the tanks, the secret police, and the nuclear codes. On paper, they commanded absolute power. In reality, they were about to discover that power is more fragile than it appears. August 18, 1991. While Gorbachev vacationed at his dacha in Crimea, the conspirators made their move. A delegation arrived at his compound, demanding he sign a decree declaring a state of emergency or resign. Gorbachev refused both. They cut his phone lines, isolating him completely. In Moscow, as midnight passed into August 19th, the operation began. KGB Special Forces, the Alpha Group, moved into position. Army units rolled toward the capital. At 6 a.m., Soviet state radio and television began broadcasting a pre-recorded message. The announcer's voice was grave. Due to Mikhail Gorbachev's inability to perform his duties for health reasons, Vice President Yanayev had assumed presidential powers. A state of emergency was declared. Political parties were suspended. Demonstrations were banned. The press was under state control. Tanks appeared on Moscow's streets. APCs took up positions at key intersections. Soldiers in combat gear surrounded government buildings. To anyone who remembered 1968, when Soviet tanks crushed the Prague Spring, or 1956 in Budapest, the message was clear. The hardliners were back in control. At 11 a.m., the GKChP held a press conference. It should have been their moment of triumph, a demonstration of authority and resolve. Instead, it became a disaster. Yanayev sat at a table, his hands trembling visibly. Journalists noticed immediately the man claiming to run the Soviet Union could barely hold a glass of water. His hands shook with what everyone assumed was a hangover. When asked about Gorbachev's illness, Yanayev stumbled through obvious lies. When pressed on whether this was a coup, he denied it unconvincingly. The press conference was broadcast live, and it shattered the coup's legitimacy before it had truly begun. This wasn't the face of strong leadership. This was the face of panic and incompetence. While the GKChP floundered, their opposition organized. Boris Yeltsin, the elected president of the Russian Republic, had not been arrested. This was the conspirators' first fatal mistake. At 9 a.m. on August 19th, Yeltsin arrived at the Russian White House, the parliament building that served as the seat of the Russian government. It was still free. The plotters had focused on Soviet institutions, forgetting that Yeltsin represented a competing power structure. Yeltsin immediately declared the GKChP illegal and called for a general strike. Then came the moment that would define the coup's failure. Just after noon, Yeltsin walked outside. Tanks surrounded the White House, but they hadn't attacked. Yeltsin climbed onto one of the tanks, a T-72, its crew watching uncertainly. Standing on the armored vehicle, Yeltsin read a statement condemning the coup and calling on Russian citizens to resist. The image was electric, an elected leader standing on a tank defying the coup plotters. Cameras captured it. Despite the emergency decree, the image spread. It became the symbol of resistance. Inside the White House, Yeltsin's supporters organized. Young military officers arrived, offering intelligence and support. Afghan war veterans, men who knew how to fight, volunteered to defend the building. Ordinary citizens showed up with nothing but their courage, forming human chains around the parliament. That night, Moscow held its breath. Would the troops attack? The GKChP had given orders to storm the White House, but something strange was happening. The soldiers were hesitating. Some units refused to advance. Others simply sat in place, their commanders paralyzed by indecision. The KGB's elite Alpha Group, trained for exactly this kind of operation, received orders to assault the White House. Their commander gathered his men and asked them a question that shouldn't have needed asking in a military unit. Should we follow these orders? The answer was no. Alpha Group stood down. August 20th dawned with the White House still standing. The coup was now in its second day, and the GKChP was losing control. That evening, 3 young men, Dmitry Komar, Ilya Krychevsky, and Vladimir Usov, died on Moscow's streets. The exact circumstances remain disputed, but they became martyrs to the resistance. Their deaths galvanized opposition. More protesters flooded to the White House. The human shield grew thicker. Inside the White House, exhaustion mixed with defiance. Yeltsin and his supporters understood they might not survive the night. They prepared for martyrdom, writing statements to be released if they were killed. But they didn't break. In military bases around Moscow, commanders faced impossible choices. Attack their own citizens, follow orders from leaders who seemed to be losing, or side with Yeltsin, committing what could be considered treason if the coup succeeded. More and more chose to wait, to do nothing. And in a coup, doing nothing is a choice, one that favors the resistance. The KGB's Kryuchkov understood the coup was failing. He had expected quick compliance, Gorbachev's resignation, Yeltsin's arrest, public acceptance of the new order. Instead, he had resistance, defections, and international condemnation. Western governments had refused to recognize the GKChP economic consequences loomed. On the night of August 20th, the GKChP made their final decision. There would be no assault on the White House. The risk was too great. If they attacked and failed, or if loyal troops refused to fight, the coup would collapse entirely. By choosing not to use decisive force, they had already lost. August 21st, the third day. By morning, it was over. The GKChP members began fleeing Moscow. Some flew to Crimea, hoping to convince Gorbachev to legitimize their actions retroactively, a desperate, absurd plan. Gorbachev refused to meet them. Yeltsin dispatched his own delegation to Crimea, escorted by loyal military units. They found Gorbachev and his family under house arrest, but alive. At 2 a.m. on August 22nd, Gorbachev's plane touched down in Moscow. The coup had failed. The GKChP members were arrested. Pugo, the interior minister, killed himself. Others would face trial, though in the chaos of the collapsing Soviet Union, justice was complicated and incomplete. But the real consequence wasn't legal, it was political. The coup had destroyed the Soviet Union. Before August 1991, the USSR's fate was uncertain. The Union might have survived in some reformed state. After the coup, it was doomed. Yeltsin had saved Gorbachev, but in doing so, he'd proven that real power now resided with the Russian Republic, not the Soviet government. The Baltic states immediately declared independence. Ukraine followed. The other republics saw the Soviet center was hollow. The Communist Party, implicated in the coup, was banned. Its property seized. For 70 years, the party had been synonymous with the Soviet state. Now it was gone. Gorbachev returned to Moscow as president of a country that was ceasing to exist. He tried to maintain authority, but he was a ghost. Yeltsin had the power now. The Soviet Union had 4 months left. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The USSR was formally dissolved. The empire was dead. The GKChP coup failed because its leaders fundamentally misunderstood the moment they were living in. They thought the Soviet Union was eternal, that it could be saved by force, that people would submit to tanks and emergency decrees as they had before. They were wrong. The Soviet system had lost legitimacy. You can't restore belief at gunpoint. The soldiers wouldn't shoot because they didn't believe anymore. The people wouldn't submit because they'd stopped fearing. The coup's failure seemed like a triumph of democracy at the time. People power defeating authoritarian reaction. And in some ways it was. But the story is more complicated. The Soviet Union's collapse unleashed chaos. Economic devastation, ethnic conflicts, the rise of oligarchs, wars in Chechnya, Georgia, Moldova. The shock therapy of the 1990s destroyed millions of lives. Putin's authoritarian state rose from the ashes of this disorder. Some of those cheering in August 1991 look back now with more complicated feelings. Was the cure worse than the disease? Could reform have worked if the coup hadn't intervened? These questions have no easy answers. What we know for certain is this: 8 men tried to stop history, and history crushed them. The GKChP lasted 72 hours. The Soviet Union they tried to save outlasted them by only 4 months. This is lost history, not because the events are unknown, but because we've forgotten what they teach us. Power without legitimacy is a hollow shell. Empires end not with a bang, but with a whimper. And sometimes, the most dramatic moments in history are over before anyone realizes the world has changed forever. The tanks rolled into Moscow on August 19, 1991. By August 21st, they rolled back out, and an empire died in the space between. This was the GKChP. This was the end of the Soviet Union. This is history that shaped our world.